President Donald Trump is now in China, with the agenda likely to be dominated by trade and the DPRK. How much in step are the two countries, and where are the biggest stumbling blocks ahead? Welcome to The Point, live from Beijing. I'm Liyuan. Now, after visiting both Japan and the Republic of Korea, President Donald Trump is now in Beijing on the third leg of his five-nation, 13-day trip to Asia. He touched down at the Beijing Capital International Airport shortly before 3 p.m. local time, and an hour later, the President and the First Lady were touring the Forbidden City with Chinese President Xi Jinping and his wife, Dr. Peng Liyuan. During the tour of the ancient palace, President Xi briefed the visiting couple on the museum's history, architecture and culture. The presidents and their wives also watched a Peking Opera performance at the Forbidden City. They then took pictures together with the performers, which drew applause and cheers from the other audience members. Now, the focus over the next 2 days, however, will be on Sino-American relations, especially coming to a common understanding about what to do with the DPRK, and on trade ties between the two countries. So what challenges lie ahead as the presidents of the two countries meet here in the Chinese capital? Joining me to talk about his President Trump's Asia trip so far are from Boston, Christopher Smart, a senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment, who is also former senior economic advisor in the Obama administration. And here in Beijing, I'm joined by Professor Zhu Chenghu from the PLA National Defense University. Gentlemen, welcome to the show. Now, Dr. Smart, the trip to China would be very different than the trip to Japan or the Republic of Korea for very obvious reasons. Some analysts are saying now that he arrived in China, the real test of the trip begins. Do you agree? If so, what do you think would be the biggest test he's faced with?
Well, I think it certainly is the point of the trip where everyone is paying attention, not just in Washington and Beijing, but all around the world, to see how this important relationship is developing. I think in many ways this is a time where China and Chinese leaders will be testing President Trump, as he is a new leader and has offered some new directions for American foreign policy and trade policy. But at the same time, I think America and U.S. officials will be testing China and testing what the outlines that President Xi gave in his speech to the Party Congress actually mean in effect in terms of China's role in Asia, China's increasing efforts to be involved in solving security issues as well as growing the global economy. So I think it will be interesting in not just the short-term relationships that the two leaders are able to build upon and all of the pageantry that you just described, but really the longer-term direction that it sets for the U.S.-China relationship.
Indeed, and here I think it is necessary to mention that President Trump is the first head of state to visit China since the closure of the 19th National Congress of the Chinese Communist Party. We'll talk about that in just a moment, but I think it is also very interesting that President Trump seems to have apparently very good personal chemistry between him and Chinese President Xi Jinping. It's said that the two had a very relaxing afternoon tea where they exchanged pleasant conversations about President Trump's granddaughter. It's reported, actually, this video is already going viral on the Chinese social media, that President Trump showed a piece of video of her granddaughter singing a song in Chinese, and President Xi and his wife, Dr. Peng, were both very impressed and sang high praise of how well the little girl spoke Chinese and how well she was singing. So, Professor Zhu, it seems that the two leaders have really been developing a growing personal rapport between themselves. How is that likely to shape bilateral ties?
I think personal ties between the top leaders of these two countries is very important for the maintenance of stability of this relationship, and also very important for the development of the relations between these two countries. It is because sometimes between these two countries there are a lot of problems, a lot of issues to be discussed, but the personal close personal ties will help to address a lot of the issues, especially those very, very difficult issues between these two countries. I believe that this sort of relationship is very, very conducive to the future development.
Mm-hmm. And we just have gotten hold of that piece of video. Let's take a look at this together.
我们一天年，美丽的天年，沥沥的河水，流过无边的稻田。
Indeed, very impressive and very sweet, and it's really moving to see that people of different cultures, they can get closer to each other by learning the language and, you know, respecting each other's culture and art. Professor Dr. Smart, let me ask you how difficult it is going to be starting tomorrow, which is on Thursday, when President Xi and President Trump sit down and talk about the serious business of DPRK and trade, especially on DPRK, because President Trump has been saying very harsh things and has been putting increasing pressure on China to do more.
Well, I think that tomorrow will be a real test for how the two leaders are able to confront such a difficult issue. They are not the first leaders in the region to try to find a peaceful and a long-term solution for North Korea's efforts to build nuclear weapons. The key, I think, will be to try and form some principles around how to manage the relationship together. President Xi told the Party Congress that China is standing tall in the East, and I think what many Americans will be looking for is to understand better his approach to managing a peaceful outcome to North Korea. China has indeed been very supportive on the latest round of UN sanctions against North Korea. But I think the question is, what do we do next? And how do we create an exit ramp for this crisis so we were able to keep North Korea on a path of de-escalation to reduce tensions around the region. So China will be a very important player in a solution to this problem, and I think everyone will be very interested in what President Xi has to say about what China can do to resolve the problem.
Yeah. Well, President Trump actually, during his trip to Japan and the Republic of Korea, has been setting the stage, right, for his negotiation, let's say, or talks with Chinese President Xi. For instance, just earlier today, Wednesday, when he was still in ROK, President Trump gave a speech to the National Assembly of that country. He called the government of DPRK a dictatorship. Let's take a listen to this soundbite.
The weapons you are acquiring are not making you safer. They are putting your regime in grave danger. Every step you take down this dark path increases the peril you face. North Korea is not the paradise your grandfather envisioned. It is a hell that no person deserves.
Well, indeed, he has been saying some very dark scenarios if the DPRK goes further on the pursuit of nuclear weapons, and he warned the DPRK not to try the United States. However, there are also analysts who are pointing out that he seemed to have softened his tone compared with the recent past by saying on Tuesday that it makes sense for North Korea to come to the table and to have a good deal that is good for the people and for the people of the world. Professor Chu, what really is the message President Trump has been sending since he embarked on this trip?
I think President Trump is quite practical on the nuclear issue in DPRK, because he has suggested on several occasions to have talks with DPRK. This is one. Secondly, I think we can see the difficulty that the world community is facing on nuclear issue. I don't think the government agencies of the United States is practical enough, because it is very, very difficult for us to denuclearize the DPRK at this stage. I think the First thing we have to do is to talk and negotiate on the future development of the nuclear issue. Without talk, I don't think it's impossible for us to denuclearize it. Thirdly, I believe that the U.S. sanctions is the sanctions for the military transfer of technologies as well as the trade, which might serve the development of the nuclear weapons and other weapons of mass destruction. But I don't think the sanctions touch upon those humanitarian aid. I think this is very, very important. Another one, I believe that the Americans will, I think the best choice for us is to negotiate on the phase of the development of the nuclear technologies, on the phase of non-nuclear, non-weaponization, and the phase of the development of intercontinental missiles, which are very important. Without this, I don't think it's impossible for us to start the process of denuclearization.
Very interesting points Professor Chu has been making there. I'm told we are just joined by Mr. Bruce Jones, the Vice President for Foreign Policy at the Brookings Institute. Mr. Jones, welcome to the discussion. Now, I would like to know your take on the issue of the possible way forward in resolving the impasse over the DPRK nuclear issue. And by the way, with all the kind of strong rhetoric anyway President Trump has been sending throughout this trip, how do you think the DPRK might react in the days ahead?
Well, I think the discussion of which I just heard a portion, it points to an important change. First of all, I should say a lot of people have suggested that when President Trump tweets about Little Rocket Man or these things, that he's kind of unhinged and it's sort of off of strategy. But I think that's wrong. I think that there's a very deliberate strategy here of maximum pressure. It's a kind of brinksmanship strategy of trying to convince the North Korean regime that ultimately if they don't come to the table willing to discuss denuclearization, that the United States is willing to use substantial military options. And there's a lot of debate around that in President Trump's team, but he's far from alone in believing that a strategy of maximum pressure is necessary here. Then, of course, if you're using a strategy of pressure to come to the table, you have to signal a willingness to come to the table, and part of the confusion has been the way President Trump has seemed to undermine Secretary of State Tillerson when Tillerson has talked about negotiations. So I thought the speech in Seoul yesterday actually was quite good in bringing all of the elements together, clearly maintaining a focus on maximum pressure, clearly maintaining the strategy of pressuring the North Korean regime to come to the table, but also opening up the line for how to get there. And then that's the first time we've seen out of this president both elements of the strategy integrated in one place.
Well, Mr. Jones, do you think his strategy has been working? I mean, he has definitely pushed Mr. Kim Jong-un further in his determination to pursue nuclear weapon. At least that's what it seems on the surface. Do you think President Trump has achieved what he wanted to achieve with this kind of, you know, extreme pressure and then signaling that he might be willing to talk?
Well, we don't know yet, but I would say, first of all, I don't think it's right to say that President Trump has convinced Kim to pursue nuclear weapons or to advance the pace of his pursuit. I think he did that all by himself. And it was pretty clear that he looked around and saw a changing scenario and saw an opportunity to drive more quickly and taking more risks in his pursuit of nuclear weapons capability, advanced nuclear weapons capability. That's his own strategy. I think that President Trump has at least partially succeeded in that there's no question that he has deepened the cooperation with Xi Jinping and with China on dealing with the North Korean problem. That's also partly North Korea's own actions and China's own reaction to them. So I think that there is a framework. Then you have to evaluate, relative to the alternatives. What are the alternatives? I think simply going straight to a negotiating table was not going to produce anything. I see no reason why North Korean regime would go to the negotiating table now on any kinds of terms that are meaningful. So I don't think there really was a negotiation option. The missing element was, as I said, when you have a strategy of maximum pressure, you have to show how you get from the pressure to the negotiations. And at least they began to do that last night. So now comes the decisive meeting, which is his meeting with Xi Jinping on this trip. in which they'll discuss this issue at length. And then the administration is going to have to decide what path to pursue from here on out. And I think we'll see a continuation of a deepening pressure, but also a greater articulation around how it is that we can get from where we are now to the negotiating table.
Okay, we're going to take a very short break, and we're going to hear from the other guests right after this. Stay with us. Welcome back. We have been talking about the DPRK issue and the meeting that President Trump is going to have with President Xi on Thursday about that country. Dr. Smart, I would like to get your response and your take on what we have been discussing. First of all, do you think that Kim Jong-un would have continued in his own pace, his program, his nuclear program, even without the kind of strong rhetoric, strong pressure from the U.S. president? And how significant do you think the meeting between President Trump and Xi is going to affect the situation?
Well, I think, as Bruce Jones just said, I think the North Korean leadership, Kim Jong-un, has been determined, or has been showing determination to proceed with his nuclear program well before the rhetoric from President Trump returned, focus on this problem. So I think it's probably wrong to put the cause in Washington for this latest series of escalations. I think what is coming into view, as we just heard, is a strategy from the United States to apply pressure, but also to signal that some sort of a negotiated solution is possible. The big question, and I think the big missing link in all of this, is where China is on this issue, what sort of a role China will play in finding a solution, and where President Xi is able to offer an incremental next step for this back and forth between Washington and Pyongyang, and an ability to map out a strategy towards a longer-term diplomatic solution. So I think we'll be very interested in what he has to say in particular over the next day or two. Professor Zhu, your thoughts?
Number one, I think the nuclear issue is basically an issue between the United States and DPRK instead of the issue between China and DPRK. China can play a role, but I don't think China can play a decisive role on that. Second is that I have proposed to the American friends that we should start negotiation as soon as possible, because there is a fact that the longer we postpone the negotiation with DPRK, I think more mature the technologies of nuclear weapons, as well as the technologies of intercontinental missiles will be. It's quite clear. It's quite understandable. I think nobody will deny it. Third one is that DPRK is facing very huge pressure and a lot of sanctions from our side, according to the resolutions of the United Nations. But I don't think Westerners do not understand Orientals very much. Sanctions and pressure do not help the resolution of the issue of nuclear issue in DPRK. The more difficulties they have, the people of Korea North Korea might be more loyal to the party. So this is the reality, and we experienced this in 1950s. Therefore, we have to be very, very practical.
Mr. Jones, what's your response to what Professor Zhu just said about the sanctions?
Well, first of all, I would agree with him that we want to get relatively quickly to a point where we're shifting from pressure to negotiations. The question is the terms in which those start. One of the challenges we're going to have is that the United States has learned over several interactions and several presidencies that negotiations and deals with the North Koreans don't work. That is to say, they cheat on the deal, we can't monitor it, the weapons program continues, etc. So there's a great deal of skepticism. And the kinds of terms that the United States are going to be able to accept in terms of deep verification of the weapons program are going to be extraordinarily hard to achieve. So even if we can get to the negotiation table, that's not a magic solution. It's going to be very, very hard to achieve an outcome there. On sanctions, look, the fact is that there are limited options here. Sanctions is part of the response. My experience of this is that when you have, it's not just sanctions, it's not just the economic pressure. It's the diplomatic signal that comes from the Russians and the Chinese and the Americans all being on the same page about pushing in a certain direction. Maintaining that unity, maintaining a strong tie between Xi and Trump on this strategy, on this question, is going to be critically important. If there's any space between Xi and Trump on their strategy here, then I think North Korea can exploit that pretty effectively. So it's less the direct economic pressure. It's more a sense that the major powers in the world are united in pushing in a certain direction, and that sharply limits the options. All of this is still going to be extraordinarily hard.
Yeah, well, I think China has been saying, and basically China has been saying that it has done what it can do at the moment. You know, China has been on board with recent UN Security Council sanctions about cutting down trade, and if you look at the numbers, the trade between China and the DPRK has been decreasing over the past several years. I'm not just talking about one season or 1 month. And however, what the US president is asking, and repeatedly, is that not just China and Russia work together to denuclearize the Korean Peninsula, which China and Russia have expressed also very resolutely. What President Trump asked from China is to cut all trade and business ties with the DPRK. I think sometimes maybe that is just something that's not practical. Mr. Jones.
Well, I think it's worse than that in the sense that if this is, I worry about this a lot, that if the United States continues to make that the core demand, I think that China can't do it, and even if they did do it, the result would be the sort of relatively quick collapse of the North Korean economy, which would have its own extremely negative consequences. So I am worried about this. I think the United States tends to believe you can kind of ratchet up the scale of sanctions from 3 to 5 to 7 to 9, and sometimes you can't do that. Sometimes your only option is to go kind of full from 3 to 10. And really do huge damage to the economy and to the state in a way that would produce a great deal of chaos. So I do think we're at a tricky moment. So far, however, I think Xi has done a good job at managing Trump on this. Trump has learned from Xi. He has come to value the relationship with Xi. And that's going to be an important stabilizing factor here. North Korea is the most important issue on the table, but the overall relationship is on the table as well, and his relationship with Xi himself is on the table. And he values the relationship, so that's going to be an important stabilizing factor here.
Indeed, bilateral ties is very important. It's much larger than the issue of DPRK or trade. And during the just concluded 19th Party Congress of the CPC, President Xi actually laid out the latest version of the concept of China's view of a new mode or new style, let's say, of international relations, which is based on mutual respect, one that is featuring justice, fairness, and based on win-win cooperation. So, Dr. Smart, I would like to ask you this question. Do you think President Trump is going to able to understand this notion? What would be President Trump's idea of a healthy international relations, and whether the two sides can find any common ground?
Well, I think President Trump's views have been evolving as he's come into office, and I think that is something that we'll see. I mean, I think there's nothing in particular in President Xi's speech that anyone could disagree with in terms of how we would all like to see the world evolve. I think what becomes more difficult is how you apply those principles in particular cases. So, like the DPRK, I think what will be important, as Bruce Jones just said, is making sure there is no daylight between Washington and Beijing and Moscow. And if the three countries can keep a single message and a single strategy together for the DPRK, I think that will be crucial. More broadly, I think what we'll be looking for as Americans and looking at the evolving relationship with China is just what the principles that President Xi outlined mean in terms of security issues, not just in the DPRK, but also in the South China Seas. Whether China is ready to have a conversation about some of these issues rather than putting facts on the ground. I think more broadly on trade, it is how China engages with institutions, the talks that we're currently having on excess steel capacity, which are very important in the U.S. economy, how China treats American companies that are investing in China and feel that suddenly the rules change on them or they are being forced to share their intellectual property in ways that they feel is inappropriate and not what they as investors had signed on for. So I think what will be very important is applying the rules that President Xi laid out in terms of mutual cooperation and win-win solutions to some of these very practical issues.
Sure, indeed. These sound a little bit lofty, right? A little bit difficult to grasp. But Professor Zhu, from your understanding, how can foreigners understand China's approach to diplomacy in this new era?
Yeah, I believe that the relationship between China and the United States is very complex. That's why President Xi Jinping has put forward the idea of establishing a new type of relationship between these two countries. One of the principles is the mutual respect, because this is very important, because we have a lot of common interests. There is no problem. But however, there are a lot of differences on a lot of issues. On these issues, to be very frank, especially on security issues, China and the United States have a trust deficit. To reduce the deficit in trust, I believe it is very, very important for us to respect each other, especially respect the core interests of both sides. Secondly, I believe that China and the United States shoulder the responsibility of addressing a lot of world issues like counter-terror, like development, like improvement of governance, etc. So on all these issues, it needs the cooperation and the cooperation between these two countries. And therefore, we have to look forward, look into the future of the world and look into the future development, and look at the responsibilities of these two countries in the future.
Yes.
This is very important.
And the opportunities. We have to leave it there. Many thanks to the three gentlemen: Christopher Smart, a senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment; Bruce Jones, the vice president for foreign policy at the Brookings Institute; and Professor Zhou Chenghu of the PLA National Defense University. Now, President Trump's trip to China could be the defining stop of his first Asia tour. Japan and the Republic of Korea are very much dependent on the U.S. in many senses. China, as the second largest economy of the world, is the real heavyweight President Trump needs to interact with in a meaningful manner. As China continues to develop towards a more prosperous country, how to treat China with respect to achieve win-win and to build together a community of shared future for mankind. And also China needs to show respect to the United States, of course. Now, these are the important questions for both presidents to ponder over. It's China's belief that the world is big enough for the two major countries to coexist and thrive side by side. A stable and healthy Sino-US partnership will be the interest of not just the two countries, but of the entire world. That's it for this edition of The Point. Before I go, again, send me your comments, stories, or questions, or videos on the theme of world poverty, as we are going to record a special program this weekend. Remember to send it to The Point with Alex at CGTN.com, or share it on Facebook using the hashtag #PovertyAndUs. Thank you for watching.